They said he was dead. The doctor signed the certificate. The undertaker closed the lid, and the earth was piled, shovelful by shovelful, onto the coffin below. But sometime after the mourners walked away, a sound came from beneath the soil. A scrape. Then another, then pounding. No one heard it, and by the time they did, the man inside had clawed until his fingers were raw, until his nails peeled back, and the wood above him was scratched bloody. His face was frozen in a scream no one would ever hear. By the time they opened the coffin, it was too late. Again. He'd died twice. Once in error, once in truth. This is not fiction. It's not a legend. It's the horrifying reality of what it means to be buried alive. And the fear was real too, so real that for more than a century, people lived in terror of waking up in their own grave. They even had a name for it: taphophobia. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medicine was a far cry from what it is today. Doctors didn't have heart monitors or advanced imaging. There were no defibrillators, no EEGs, no ventilators. If a person stopped breathing, stopped moving, and showed no pulse, they were presumed dead. But presumed wasn't always right. All over Europe and the United States, people were being buried alive. It happened to the young and the old, the sick and the healthy, the rich and the poor. And when it happened, it was rarely discovered, because most of those coffins stayed shut. But every now and then, they opened one, and what they found inside changed everything. In 1822, in the town of Freiburg, Germany, a young woman named Margaretha Scheicknecht was declared dead after a short illness. Her body was dressed and placed in the family crypt. Days later, the tomb was opened to admit another member of the family, and the scene inside was unforgettable. Margaretha had not remained where she had been laid. Her body was twisted, her burial shroud torn to pieces. Her fingers were bloodied and curled, the coffin lid above her gouged with deep, frantic scratches. She had awoken in total darkness, and she had died trying to escape it. Stories like Margaretha's weren't rare. They were common enough to be documented in medical journals, newspapers, even government reports. One such case made headlines in France in 1889. A man named Philippe Arias had fallen unconscious and was presumed dead. He was buried quickly, as was customary at the time. But as the gravediggers filled in the dirt, a faint knocking was heard. At first, no one believed it. Then came a muffled scream. The coffin was dug up and opened. Inside, Philippe was very much alive, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. He had been buried for less than an hour. He survived. Barely. It became a scandal. Doctors were embarrassed. Authorities were alarmed. And the public? The public was terrified. The fear of premature burial gripped entire nations. In Victorian England, it became an obsession. Magazines published horror stories about coffins clawed from within. Grave robbers told tales of bodies found turned sideways or upside down. Widows left mirrors in caskets so that, if their loved one awoke, they'd at least see a face before the darkness swallowed them. And for those with the means, there were solutions. The safety coffin industry exploded. One of the most famous inventions was patented by a man named Franz Wester in 1868. His design included a bell and a string tied around the wrist of the corpse. If the string was pulled, the bell rang, alerting graveyard staff to dig the person up. Others included breathing tubes, feeding lines, even glass panels to let in sunlight. Some had flags that would pop up if the body moved. Others had periscopes, whistles, or even mechanical arms that could strike a metal gong above the grave. It sounds absurd now, but back then, it was deadly serious, because people were still waking up inside their coffins, and most weren't as lucky as Philippe. In South Carolina in 1891, a young woman named Octavia Smith Hatcher fell into a coma after a mysterious illness. She was pronounced dead and buried the very next day. But soon after, other townspeople began exhibiting similar symptoms and waking up after days of unresponsiveness. Octavia's husband was horrified. He ordered her exhumation. When the coffin was opened, they found that Octavia had turned over. Her face was frozen in terror. Her nails were torn and her fingertips bloodied. She had woken up, deep underground, and died a second time, suffocating in fear. Her grave remains in Pikeville, Kentucky, marked by a large statue. Locals still leave flowers and whisper prayers for the girl who died twice. Even into the 20th century, the horror continued. In 1937, a man named Angelo Hayes, just 19 years old, was thrown from his motorcycle in southern France. He struck his head and lost consciousness. Cold to the touch, no pulse, no signs of life. Doctors declared him dead. A funeral was held, a casket prepared. Angelo was buried. But insurance inspectors grew suspicious. His family had recently taken out a large policy on him. The body was ordered exhumed 2 days later. To their shock, Angelo was alive. He had been in a deep coma, not dead, and somehow he had survived those 2 days underground. He went on to invent one of the most advanced safety coffins of the time, complete with a breathing tube, signal bell, food, and even a radio. He spent the rest of his life warning others, do not assume. Always check. I am proof that doctors can be wrong. And doctors were wrong. A lot. In 1903, medical researchers surveyed 219 physicians and asked how many had seen cases where people were nearly buried alive. Nearly 40% said they had personally witnessed such cases. The stories varied. Some found breathing in dead patients. Others saw movement. One even watched a body begin to sit upright on the embalming table. Mistaken death was not rare. It was terrifyingly possible. Perhaps the most disturbing case of all was discovered during cemetery renovations in New Orleans in the 1850s. The grave of a man named Victor Latour was being moved. When the coffin was opened, the workers screamed. Victor's body was twisted violently. The wooden lid had claw marks gouged into it. His fingernails were missing. His face was contorted in horror, jaw dislocated, as if frozen in mid-scream. There was no doubt. Victor had been buried alive and had died trapped in agony. To this day, the records from that relocation are held in Louisiana's state archives and cited in studies on premature burial. His death, like so many others, was preventable, if only someone had noticed. The medical term is apparent death. In cases of catalepsy, hypothermia, or severe trauma, a body may appear lifeless, no pulse, no breath, but still alive. Even in the modern age, mistakes happen. In 2010, a woman in Kazakhstan was declared dead after collapsing. Her body was placed in a morgue refrigerator. But when the family came to collect her the next day, a staff member noticed the bag was moving. She had woken up, frozen, confused, but alive. In Detroit in 2020, a 20-year-old woman was pronounced dead by paramedics after suffering cardiac arrest. Hours later, funeral home staff discovered she was still breathing. She survived. And in 2023, a woman in Ecuador was declared dead after suffering a stroke. At her wake, mourners screamed as she began moving inside her coffin. She opened her eyes and gasped for air. She lived for another week. Even now, even today, it happens. So the next time you walk through an old cemetery, pause at the graves. Think of the names, the dates, the lives, and wonder, did they die peacefully? Or did someone wake up in the dark, deep underground, screaming for help that would never come? It wasn't folklore, it wasn't fiction, it was real, and in the right or wrong moment, it could happen again. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.